Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at Montesquieu's The Spirit of Laws.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, a book from 1748, is that really relevant today?
Right.
But trust me, this isn't just some dusty old history lesson.
Yeah.
The Spirit of Laws is considered, a foundational text in political theory, and we're going to uncover why.
Yeah, it's incredible how Montesquieu was writing, centuries ago, and yet the questions that he was grappling with about power and liberty and just how we organize ourselves as societies are still so relevant to the world that we live in today.
Yeah. So to kind of set the stage, one of the first things Montesquieu does in this book is he lays out these three main types of government: republics, monarchies, and despotisms.
Right.
And he doesn't just like list them out. He really tries to dive into the nature of each.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting. He's arguing that each of these forms of government is driven by a very specific principle. So for republics, it's civic virtue. And you can think about ancient Rome, for example, where, citizens were actively participating in government and they were putting the common good above their own self-interest.
Yeah. And then you have monarchies. And in a monarchy, the principle is honor.
Yeah.
So, picture those royal courts in Europe, where it's all about social hierarchy and a sense of duty.
Right.
And then lastly, you have despotism. And this is where fear is the name of the game.
Right, where power is completely concentrated.
Total power.
And there's no room for dissent, and the people are living in fear. And Montesquieu really captures the kind of oppressive silence of those types of regimes.
It's kind of chilling when you think about it. He's not just describing these systems, but he's also, like you said, painting a picture of what it's like to actually live under these different forms of government. But, moving on to something that Montesquieu is, really famous for, this idea of the separation of powers.
Yes.
What's really groundbreaking here is that he wasn't just describing the systems that were already in place, but he was actually proposing this whole new way to structure a government to prevent tyranny.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
He argued that in order to safeguard liberty, you have to divide power.
Okay.
You have to split it up between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of government so that no one entity has absolute power and they're able to check and balance each other.
So true. And it's just amazing to think about how this idea that he put forward, all those years ago is literally woven into the fabric of so many governments today.
Right. I mean, think about the U.S. Constitution, which is directly influenced by Montesquieu's idea of separation of powers.
Absolutely. And, speaking of ideas that might be a little bit controversial, I want to touch on his views on climate because Montesquieu actually suggests that the climate of a region can influence the temperament of its people.
Yes.
And by extension, what kinds of laws and governments might be best suited for that place.
Right. And he makes some pretty bold claims. Like he says that hot climates tend to breed, I think he uses the phrase, indolence and passivity in people, which makes them more suitable for, a despotic rule.
Okay.
And he uses India as an example.
Okay.
Whereas cold climates, he associates them with strength and independence. And those, he says, are more conducive to liberty. And he points to the Northern European nations as an example.
Wow. I can see why those ideas might raise a few eyebrows today. I mean, is there any merit to those claims, or is that just a product of his time? What do you think?
It's a really interesting question, and I think, it definitely challenges us to think about the complex interplay of geography and culture and governance.
Yeah.
But, perhaps a more nuanced way to look at it is that maybe climate can play a role in shaping the initial conditions.
Okay.
But ultimately, societies evolve and adapt in ways that go beyond just pure determinism.
So it's not this simple equation. Like he's trying to say, well, if you live in this type of climate, this is what your government's going to be like.
Yeah, exactly.
But okay. So speaking of complex factors, Montesquieu also really delves into the role of commerce and luxury in society.
Yes.
And he kind of saw it as a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, he thought that commerce could lead to, peace and cooperation between nations. But on the other hand,
yeah, he worried that this pursuit of wealth could lead to moral corruption and that it could actually undermine civic virtue, especially in republics.
Yeah.
And he uses the fall of the Roman Republic as a cautionary tale there.
Interesting. So how did he see luxury playing out in monarchies and despotisms?
So he actually saw luxury as necessary for monarchies because it helped maintain that hierarchy, that system of rewards and status. Whereas in despotisms, Luxury just fueled the ruler's greed and further oppressed the people.
Oh, wow.
So it's fascinating how he really analyzed the impact of luxury depending on which political system you're talking about.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if some of his concerns about wealth and corruption are still relevant in our world today.
Right. I mean, think about our globalized economy. Are there any parallels there? Are we seeing any echoes of what he was talking about?
Yeah, yeah. Great point. And, another thing, just to shift gears a little bit, Montesquieu was incredibly outspoken against slavery.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
mean, he saw it as inherently unjust, no matter what the historical or economic context might be.
What's so striking is that he didn't just condemn it morally.
Right.
He systematically took apart the justifications that were used to defend slavery back then,
Wow.
particularly the arguments based on, climate or the supposed inferiority of certain races. And remember, this is the 18th century
Yeah.
when these ideas were widely accepted.
So ahead of his time. And it's just amazing to think that his words actually contributed to this growing abolitionist movement.
Mhm.
And it, really helped to shift the moral compass on such a, critical issue.
Right, because his ideas were powerful, and he used them to try to advocate for a more just and humane world. But he didn't stop there. He also looked at the factors that contribute to the rise and fall of empires. And he really breaks down how internal corruption and the decay of civic virtue and the abuse of power can topple even the mightiest states.
I mean, just thinking about the Roman Empire and how, it was this slow decline, over time that ultimately led to its collapse.
Yeah.
I mean, does his analysis offer any insight into the trajectories of, modern day powers? Like, are there any parallels that we can draw?
It's a question worth considering.
Yeah.
Are there similar patterns playing out on the world stage today? And it's fascinating to think about how his historical lens might be able to illuminate what's happening in our present moment.
Totally, totally. I mean, we've only just scratched the surface of this book, but it's already, so mind-blowing. I'm already seeing how Montesquieu's ideas really transcend time
Yeah.
and offer valuable insight into the very nature of power, governance, and the human condition.
Yeah, that's the beauty of engaging with a thinker like Montesquieu. He's really giving us a springboard to analyze not just the past, but also the present and the future.
So true.
And, one of the things that's so relevant about Montesquieu's work is that he recognized that there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to government.
Uh,
He was arguing that laws shouldn't just be created, in a vacuum.
right.
They need to be tailored to the specific circumstances of a nation. So its history, its culture, even its geography, its religious beliefs, all of those things play a role.
It's like he's saying to create a successful system, you really need to understand the ingredients of that society and then craft laws that actually fit those ingredients.
Precisely. And this leads us to another key concept from the book, and that's the distinction between political liberty and civil liberty.
Right.
Now, these terms get thrown around a lot,
They do.
but Montesquieu gives us a really insightful way to think about how they relate to each other.
Okay, so remind me, what's the distinction that he makes?
So for Montesquieu, political liberty is about your right to participate in government,
Okay.
to have a voice in shaping the laws that govern you. So think about voting, assembly, being able to freely express your opinions without fear of, punishment.
Okay.
So it's about being an active citizen.
Got it. Okay. And then what about civil liberty?
So civil liberty, that's more about the freedom to live your life without undue interference from the government.
Okay.
So it's the freedom to go about your business, pursue your interests, enjoy your property, all without this fear of arbitrary arrest or, having your property seized. It's about the space that you have as an individual.
So political liberty is more about having a say in the public sphere, and civil liberty is more about just having this autonomy in your private life.
Exactly.
Okay. Did he see those two types of liberty as being in conflict with each other at all?
Not at all. In fact, he saw them as deeply intertwined.
Oh, interesting.
And he argued that you can't have true civil liberty without political liberty because, if you have no voice in shaping the laws, you're always vulnerable to the whims of those in power.
Yeah, makes sense.
But he also acknowledged that political liberty can be abused.
Right.
If people become so focused on their own individual interests and kind of lose sight of the common good, that can lead to chaos and instability.
So it's about striking a balance
Yes.
between protecting those individual freedoms
Yes.
and also ensuring that society as a whole is stable and everyone's well-being is taken care of.
Exactly, yeah. It's a tightrope walk.
It sounds like it.
And this is where the rule of law becomes so important. Montesquieu believed that a strong, impartial legal system was absolutely essential for safeguarding both political and civil liberty. So, the law should apply equally to everyone, no matter your social status, and it should be administered fairly and transparently.
So everyone knows the rules of the game,
Yes,
and everyone can trust that those rules are going to be enforced fairly.
exactly. And this is what helps to build trust in the system.
Right.
And within that system, Montesquieu also emphasized the need for an independent judiciary. So judges should be free from political pressure so they can make their decisions based on the law and on the evidence and not on what politicians or powerful people want them to do.
Yeah. What I'm really struck by, and this is kind of a theme that's emerging as we're talking, is Montesquieu's deep appreciation for just how complex human societies are.
Right.
He's not trying to create some sort of, perfect utopian scheme or anything like that.
Yeah.
He's trying to really grapple with this messy reality. You know how all these different factors, climate, culture, history, economics, all interact to shape a nation and its laws.
And I think that's one of the reasons why his work has endured for so long.
Yeah.
Because he's not about easy answers or, imposing rigid ideologies.
Right.
It's about asking the right questions, recognizing the nuance, and understanding that there are always going to be trade-offs to make.
I mean, it's refreshing, honestly,
Hmm.
to think that he was writing this almost 300 years ago and we're still having these same conversations today
Right.
about liberty, about equality, about justice.
Yeah, these are age-old questions that humanity has been grappling with for centuries.
Exactly, exactly. But, Montesquieu gives us this framework for approaching them in a way that's thoughtful
Right.
and nuanced.
Yeah, and he encourages us to move beyond those kind of simple, simplistic solutions
Right.
and embrace those complexities of political and social life. Now, one thing I do want to highlight is how he connects the form of government to the very character of a nation.
Okay.
He argues that, republics, they tend to foster this civic virtue, this idea of public service,
Right.
while monarchies often promote this sense of honor and duty. So it's not just about the structure, it's about the values that those structures actually cultivate.
So it's not just passing laws, it's shaping a culture.
Exactly.
But then what about despotisms? What kind of character do they breed?
Well, Montesquieu's view is pretty bleak there.
Okay.
He suggests that despotisms, they breed fear and obedience, they discourage any kind of independent thinking or any challenge to authority.
So it's like they create this collective paralysis.
Yes, exactly.
Where people are so afraid to speak out that they just withdraw from public life altogether.
Exactly. And this can have a devastating effect on society as a whole because when people lose trust in their government and in each other, it becomes nearly impossible to solve those shared problems that we all have.
It's like everyone's just looking out for themselves because they feel like they can't rely on anyone else.
Right.
Which I guess brings us back to why Montesquieu was such a strong advocate for limited government and individual rights.
Yeah, he saw concentrated power as inherently dangerous.
Huh.
And he believed that in order to protect liberty, you have to disperse power. You have to implement those checks and balances, and you have to enshrine individual rights into law. And this message is so relevant, I think, to what's going on in the world today, where we see authoritarianism on the rise in many parts of the world and democratic values under threat.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that liberty is fragile.
Yes.
And we can't take it for granted. It requires constant vigilance to protect it.
Absolutely. And it also underscores how important civic engagement is. Montesquieu believed that a healthy republic depends on citizens who are informed, who participate in public life, and who hold their leaders accountable. So it's not enough to just have these rights on paper. You have to actually exercise them.
So it's like the right to vote or the freedom of speech. Those are tools.
Yes.
And they're only useful if we actually use them to shape our society.
Exactly. And this is where education comes in. Montesquieu saw an educated citizenry as the best defense against tyranny. Because when people are equipped with knowledge, they're better able to understand those complex issues, make good decisions, and resist any kind of manipulation.
So knowledge is power.
Yes.
And an informed citizenry is a society's most powerful weapon against oppression.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, one aspect of Montesquieu's work that I think sometimes gets overlooked is his analysis of the relationship between law and commerce.
Right.
It's incredibly insightful, I think, especially in our globalized world.
Right. And he recognized that commerce can be this powerful engine for growth and prosperity.
Yes.
But at the same time, he also saw that it had this potential to create inequality and division.
It's that double-edged sword idea again.
Yes, exactly.
We saw that with luxury. And now we're seeing it with commerce. There are benefits, but there are also potential downsides.
Right. And for Montesquieu, the role of law was to regulate commerce in a way that kind of maximized the benefits while minimizing the harm. So preventing monopolies, protecting consumers, ensuring fair competition, all of those things, he argued, required really careful, legal
It's
frameworks.
not about stifling commerce. It's about making sure that it can flourish, but in a way that serves everyone.
Exactly. It's about setting those ground rules so that everybody has a fair shot and the system benefits society as a whole.
Yeah, yeah.
And he takes it a step further by highlighting the importance of international law and international cooperation.
Oh, wow.
Because he recognized that in an interconnected world, nations need to work together to regulate trade,
Right.
resolve disputes peacefully, and create a system that benefits everyone.
I mean, he was so ahead of his time talking about international cooperation back then. I mean, here we are in the 21st century.
Still trying to grapple with these issues of globalization, still trying to build this more just and equitable world order.
Right. And his work provides this roadmap for how to navigate these complexities.
Yeah.
And he reminds us that even though commerce can be this force for good, it has to be guided by these principles of fairness and justice and human dignity.
So we can't just let the market run wild.
Right.
We need to create those ethical boundaries
Yes.
and institutions that make sure that everyone benefits.
Exactly. And this brings us to the role of government in the economy. Montesquieu believed that governments have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable from exploitation,
Okay.
regulate industries that could harm the public, and provide a safety net for those who are struggling.
Now, that's a very different view than, that kind of laissez-faire approach to economics.
Right.
That was so dominant for so long.
Exactly.
And he's not promoting socialism or anything,
Right.
but it's just a more balanced approach.
Yes. Recognizing that if capitalism is just left completely unchecked, it can lead to all these problems.
Exactly, yeah. He's advocating for a system where the market serves humanity, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And this is incredibly relevant as we face these challenges of inequality today and the growing demands for economic justice. It's amazing how much wisdom we can still find in a book that was written almost 300 years ago.
It really is. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive for today, I want to circle back to one of Montesquieu's most famous ideas,
Yes.
and that's the separation of powers.
Right.
I mean, it's such a foundational concept in modern democracies,
Yeah.
and it's just fascinating to see how he developed this idea as part of this broader analysis of government and law.
So he argued that to prevent tyranny and to safeguard liberty, government power needs to be divided and distributed amongst different branches.
Right. So we have the legislative branch making the laws,
Yes.
the executive branch enforcing them, and then the judicial branch interpreting the laws.
Precisely. And each branch has the power to check and balance the other branches.
Right.
So
Yeah.
no one branch becomes too powerful, and there's this built-in system of accountability.
It's a brilliant system on paper,
Yes.
but we see all the time how it plays out in these messy ways.
Of course, yeah.
Even here in the U.S., we have this constant tension between the president and Congress.
Right.
And, the Supreme Court is often accused of overreaching its authority.
Yeah.
But overall, it seems like the system is holding up.
It is, yeah. And I think it's a testament to how powerful Montesquieu's insight was that this system, which was developed centuries ago, is still a vital safeguard of liberty in the world today.
It really makes you wonder what Montesquieu would think of our world. I mean,
Mhm.
with challenges like climate change, artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
the power of social media. I mean, things he couldn't have even imagined back then.
Yeah.
How would he apply these principles of, liberty, justice, good governance
Mm-hmm.
to these 21st century problems?
It's a fascinating thought experiment.
It is.
And I think his work gives us that framework for thinking critically about these issues and approaching them with, a nuanced understanding of power dynamics and the human condition.
It's incredible how, even though Montesquieu was writing centuries ago,
Mm-hmm.
his work still feels so relevant to so many of the conversations that we're having today.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's giving us this lens to understand not just the past, but also all the complexities of our present,
Mm.
and maybe even get a glimpse of what the future could hold.
It's true. And, one of the things that really strikes me about his work is how he constantly challenges us to think about those principles that guide our actions, both as individuals
Right.
and as societies.
Yeah.
He's urging us to, look beyond the surface, to really grapple with that spirit, that's behind the laws and institutions that we create.
Right. It's not just about, memorizing the legal codes or the historical facts or whatever.
Yeah.
It's about understanding that deeper logic, the values,
Yes.
the beliefs
Yes.
that shape those systems.
And that's where his idea of the spirit of a nation comes in.
Right.
He argued that every nation has this unique character,
Okay.
and that it's molded by its history, its geography, its religious beliefs, and countless other factors.
Mm.
And he believed that this spirit, this essence of a nation,
Uh-huh.
should be reflected in its laws and its institutions.
So it's not about trying to impose some,
Yeah.
preconceived abstract ideal of what a government or legal system should look like. It's about understanding the context,
Exactly.
the specific circumstances of a nation, and then tailoring those laws to fit.
Yeah. In fact, he was really critical of the idea of just blindly copying laws from other countries.
Oh, interesting.
He was arguing that what works in one place might not work somewhere else.
Right, right.
You can't just transplant a system without thinking about the soil that it's going to grow in.
You can't just, take a plant that thrives in, a tropical rainforest
Exactly.
and expect it to do well in the desert. So you need to consider those different factors.
And I think this highlights, one of the most important takeaways from the spirit of laws.
Okay.
Good governance really requires this deep understanding of human nature.
Yeah.
And all of those incredibly complex factors that influence how we behave, both as individuals and in groups.
So it's like he's saying that to create a just and functional society, you kind of have to be an anthropologist in a way.
Right.
You need to study the customs,
Yes.
beliefs, values of the people you're governing.
And then create laws that are in harmony with that unique spirit.
And not try to force them into some, predetermined box.
Exactly. And he also stresses the importance of things like moderation and balance and respect for that diversity of human experience. He
Right.
wasn't a fan of, extremism or forcing rigid ideologies onto these complex societies.
He's acknowledging that there's no one perfect solution that's going to work for everyone everywhere.
Right. It's about adapting to the specific circumstances. It's about trial and error. It's about understanding that people change over time.
And that their needs and desires change.
Exactly. So it's this constant balancing act between, different values, different interests.
Right.
Individual rights versus the collective good.
Yeah.
Liberty versus order. It's a constant negotiation.
Well, this has been such a thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah.
It's not just about learning historical facts.
Right.
It's about really engaging with these ideas that are still shaping our world today.
I agree. And I think that's the power of Montesquieu. He really forces us to ask ourselves some really big questions. Like, how do we balance individual freedom with the need for order?
Right.
What is the role of government in promoting justice and the well-being of its people?
Right.
How do we create systems that are adaptable, resilient, and truly serve the people?
And I think the best way to honor Montesquieu and his legacy is to keep those questions alive.
Yeah.
To apply those insights that we've gleaned from his work to the challenges that we face today, and to never stop striving for that world where, liberty and justice and the rule of law prevail.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And to our listeners, if you're looking for a book that'll challenge your assumptions and really make you think deeply about power and about governance and just the very nature of society, I highly recommend picking up a copy of The Spirit of Laws.
Yes.
Because even though it was written centuries ago, it offers this timeless wisdom that is just as relevant today as it ever was.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final question.
Okay.
Inspired by Montesquieu's work, given all the rapid technological advancements that we're seeing today and how quickly the global landscape is evolving, how do you think those principles of liberty and separation of powers and the rule of law need to adapt to make sure that we create a just and flourishing society in the future?
That's a question that I think deserves a lot of careful thought and consideration. And as you continue to, explore Montesquieu's ideas and grapple with all the complexities of our modern world, just remember that even centuries later, the spirit of laws still gives us these valuable insights into what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And this challenge of building a better society for all.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the spirit of laws. We'll see you next time.